Good morning, everyone. I'm Tim O'Brien. I'm the Senior Executive Editor of Bloomberg Opinion, and this is our politics live stream that you're all joining. And we have two guests who are particularly well suited for the topic at hand today, which is Donald Trump's second administration and foreign affairs, foreign wars, national security, and the perilous road ahead. We're joined today by Andreas Kluth, who is a national security and foreign affairs columnist for Bloomberg Opinion, and Hal Brands, who is also a columnist for Bloomberg Opinion and is one of the bright lights at Johns Hopkins on international affairs, national security, and everything that crosses in between. Thank you both for joining today. I'd like to tell our audience that we take questions. So if you have any, please put them in the stream, and our amazing producer, Mary Newman, will pluck them out of the ether and try to put them in front of us, and we will answer them as best we can. So, Hal, let's start with your most recent column for Bloomberg Opinion, in which you framed Trump 2.0 around 5 possibilities for thinking about how he may operate as an actor on the international stage. And to get us rolling here, why don't you lay some of that out for us?
Sure. I think one of the reasons the current moment feels so uncertain is that you have a volatile American president coming into a volatile world. And so the world is full of potential conflicts and ongoing conflicts and frozen conflicts. And while Trump is not as unpredictable as he sometimes seems, he is very tactically flexible and tactically volatile. And so when you put all that together, it just creates a bigger band of uncertainty around U.S. foreign policy than you usually get. And so in trying to think where this could all end up 4 years from now, you have a range of scenarios, everything from what Trump is promising, which is sort of a full spectrum rejuvenation of American power, making America great again in the Middle East and in dealing with the Russia-Ukraine war and a variety of other things, all the way to just sort of pervasive confusion and disorganization, because he will face internal challenges, there will be bureaucratic dysfunction, and then there are various scenarios in between. And so the key takeaway here is that the U.S. itself has become one of the greatest sources of uncertainty in a world that's already much more uncertain than it was 4 years ago or 8 years ago.
Do you expect Trump to be an aggressive actor, Hal? Do you expect him, to go beyond just saber rattling and actually decide to put troops on the ground? He's already said yesterday that Ukraine should think about going its own way and ending the war. He's been very vocal about being opposed to deepening U.S. involvement in Syria, but hasn't talked about other Middle Eastern hotspots. Does that just feel like a big unknown to you, Hal?
I think this is an area where Trump's instincts are fairly clear. He uses coercion, particularly economic coercion, pretty liberally. And so his first response to any challenge is to threaten sanctions, tariffs, other means of making countries economically uncomfortable. He's much more disciplined and focused in his use of force, in part because to the extent that Trump made any meaningful campaign promises on foreign policy, which just didn't figure that prominently in the campaign, it was no more wars, right? Particularly no more wars in the Middle East. And so if you put that together with the experience of Trump's first term, he's willing to use force in fairly aggressive ways when American lives, American property, American interests are threatened, much less likely to do so in defense of an international order or in defense of allies. And so the example I would give is that Trump was unwilling to use force in response to Iran's attack on Saudi oil facilities in 2019. He only became willing to use force once Iranian proxies killed an American contractor in Iraq and threatened the U.S. embassy. So that part of Trump's behavior, I think, is fairly consistent.
There's also the possibility that some of it Saudi Arabia had to do with his own family's financial ties there, which is another unusual and random factor in all of this. Is that lurking in the back of his mind? I think when he assesses some of these situations, as there's a narrow and more personal, opportunistic element to this that we can get into later. Andreas, you wrote yesterday about the madman theory. So tell our audience what the madman theory is, and then why you decided to layer that on top of Trump 2.0.
Well, it segues to what Hal just said about unpredictability. In a way, all of us in Washington, D.C., but everyone in the world is trying to figure out many things about Trump, but this point of unpredictability, which he keeps making again and again, and all of his minions and advisors say as well. The theory, if you step back, the bumper sticker, I mean, Trump's policy is all bumper stickers. The bumper sticker is peace through strength. If you go one step back from that, the strength, where does that allegedly come from? And it is the madman theory. And that's a term that was coined by Richard Nixon in the context of North Vietnam and dropping nukes. It didn't work for Nixon. But there's also quite a lot of academic research going back to Machiavelli about the madman theory. And it's quite simply, and Trump keeps saying this, Xi Jinping wouldn't dare to invade Taiwan because he knows I'm effing crazy. And he says that about all these leaders. And he essentially has this act about being unpredictable is the word, and therefore crazy. He might do anything. Same in the trade area. So question number one is he just faking it? In which case everyone will realize he's faking it. If you think he's playing a game of chicken with all these world leaders, the problem is he has to play round after round of chicken in that game theory where you drive toward each other and you swerve last. That's the way you win. And what if he is crazy? If he's faking it, it won't work for him for long, and then his strength will be gone, and there won't be peace the peace that he promises. If he is crazy and unpredictable, then, and this is the sort of fun part, there's now a lot of researchers looking at what kind of crazy, and because there actually is a typology, and you have to think, well, someone like Kim Jong-un might be in his way crazy too. So what happens when they play chicken? In the case of Trump, if he's not faking it, it looks a lot like he is genuinely unpredictable about everything. And that happens to be the worst kind of crazy, because enemies will assume they can't make it right for you anyway. You're always unpredictable. They might as well. And friends, allies will assume, well, you're unpredictable. We have to make other arrangements. So it doesn't actually make you strong. It doesn't help you, to use that word again, coerce. This is all a big question mark because we genuinely don't know. Is it an act? Is it not? Is he unpredictable? If so, in all situations or just in one? For example, Taiwan or Ukraine or the Middle East or something else?
Andreas, I want to just, before we leave that behind, focus on Nixon and the madman theory. The argument was he was threatening to drop, I think, 5 nuclear bombs on North Vietnam, and neither the Chinese nor the Russians felt that he was serious about that, and it may well be that he was saber rattling to get concessions. But it doesn't have to walk up to nuclear weapons or global annihilation for the idea of I might be crazy enough to do X. It could also be instigating a tactical engagement or deploying troops on the ground, or things that are seen as provocative or incendiary that Trump could, particularly in Ukraine, for example, make use of that doesn't have to walk up to a nuclear confrontation. Or am I misinterpreting things?
Absolutely. So in the case of Richard Nixon, he set off, there's a book about it, or at least one, a global nuclear alert, and he had strategic bombers flying back and forth, refueling in the air. He wanted to scare the Soviets in Moscow and Hanoi, and that didn't work probably because they realized he was talking rationally about being irrational, which sort of Trump is too. This kind of irony is one logical problem of several in this. It didn't work for Nixon. It didn't work for Trump last time either, but you're with Kim Jong-il, for instance, with Kim Jong-un, for example, that was, he promised fire and fury. They had summits in Hanoi, and Kim Jong-un realized, this guy, I cannot rely on him, walked off, and instead of halting the nuclear arsenal, built it up. But as you just said, it doesn't have to go all the way up to nuclear, although if you're really going to pretend being nuclear, that it's nice to have nukes, but it could be, for example, even just at the lower level in the case of trade, think of the game of chicken where you're racing toward each other. Who's going to go crazier first? Who's going to rip off the steering wheel, throw it out of the window so that the other guy swerves? That's what Trump is thinking. And so he could, right now, he's like, even against friends like Canada and Mexico, and we just had someone resign in Canada because over this issue on how to respond. But he's threatening these huge and disastrous and ruinous for America tariffs. That's a kind of madman theory too. That means, like, I don't care if I ruin my own economy, I'm going to hurt you so much, do whatever I say. So it's
Right.
that kind of risk taking to various situations. But keep in mind that every time he's doing this all over the world, and the whole rest of the world is watching and seeing how it actually plays out. And right now he has the benefit of another month and a half of Schrodinger's cat, where all options are out there. Eventually, some of these games of chicken will be decided. And then the next guy will say, I saw him, he was just faking it. Now I'll adjust to that.
Hal, do you have a thought about that? Because I think it feels to me like, the madman theory optimized across 3 different theaters of active or potential war becomes anarchy. But what do you think about that specifically?
Well, there is a real insight at the heart of Trump's threats and Trump's behavior, which is just that the U.S. is by far the most powerful actor in the world, especially in economic terms. Most other countries in the world are asymmetrically dependent on the United States. They need the United States more than we need them. That's true of Canada and Mexico. It's true of China. It's true of almost every other country in the world. And so when Trump threatens tariffs, his calculation is that, this will result in discomfort for American consumers, although there's also some thinking that it will crowd in investment into the United States. But it'll be far worse for the people I am threatening to hit with these tariffs, and so they will concede on X issue. It's not going to work in every case. The stakes may be such that it's politically costly for another leader to concede or things like that. But the basic insight, which is that the U.S. can squeeze more out of each international transaction if it uses its unmatched power more boldly, isn't necessarily wrong. The challenge is that it's hard to get your way on every issue at once across all of these theaters, as Andreas mentioned. And if your reputation as a superpower depends on being a source of stability in the international system, then presumably there is a cost that isn't paid all at once, but that is paid over the long term and in increments if you become a source of instability instead.
Hal, in this scenario, one of the tricky things with Trump, obviously, is that he's often non-strategic. He could be unhinged or instinctive, depending on the day. And the other factor to think about that is, well, then in those moments, who's going to be in his ear? He famously doesn't really listen to outside advisors. He'll ultimately go his own way frequently. But it looks like Marco Rubio will be Secretary of State. It's unclear if Pete Hegseth will be the Defense Secretary. That's been a sort of a scandal-ridden volleyball so far from a nomination perspective. And he has a nominee for National Security Advisor who's well regarded. How do you see sort of that trio of advisors, whoever they wind up being, staking out both advisory turf and policy turf within Trump's White House?
So I think the nominees and appointees are a real mixed bag. You have some like Mike Waltz and Marco Rubio, who in any other age we would consider to be Reagan Republicans, who would be plausible candidates for these positions in a different administration. And then we have some like Tulsi Gabbard or Pete Hegseth, who just never in a million years would have been considered for the positions to which they've been nominated in an administration other than Trump's. I think there are kind of two broad factors that emerge from all this. The first is that Trump is setting up an administration that is keyed to ideological and personal loyalty, right? There's no Jim Mattis, there's no Rex Tillerson, there's no H.R. McMaster in this administration. These were all people who were willing to go toe to toe with Trump on important issues repeatedly when they thought that he was doing the wrong thing or had the wrong instincts. There's not going to be any of that this time around because Trump learned his lesson from the first time around, and he is appointing people where the primary criterion is their willingness to follow him personally and politically. The second dynamic is that I think we're headed for an administration where there is a high amount of internal dysfunction, and it's going to be different than the dysfunction the first time around. The dysfunction the first time around came from the fact that Trump and his advisors fundamentally disagreed on key issues, whether the U.S. should stay in Syria or the U.S. commitment to certain alliances or whatever the case may be. There's going to be less of that this time for the reasons that I mentioned. But you have a bunch of advisors who have very little experience running big bureaucracies or running interagency processes. And you also have a number of advisors who were appointed because they're expected to go to war with the agencies and departments that they lead. And so when you put those two things together, I think there's going to be a pretty big mess that emerges as the Trump administration tries to act on key policy issues.
And lots of potential infighting, which already occurred just during the kind of brokering and jockeying at Mar-a-Lago for position and nominations. And even the small amount of that came out was unusually, craven in many ways and also confusing. Andreas, one of our viewers, a TikTok user, said Trump only cares about his pocket, not us. Do you guys see that in his foreign policy? So in other words, how much will Trump's own financial incentives play a role in how he makes decisions apart from everything else we've talked about?
He's never separated that really, and sort of his ecosystem down to Fox News. Then it's all the more, should we say, hypocritical when and then focus on others, on the other side. But he's never separated those two, whatever, like soccer ball he's selling at the moment and his policies, and it was hotels ones. And of course, within his family, I mean, his pocket, or probably his son-in-law's pocket and so forth, he probably, in his mind, doesn't draw a distinction. I'm not going to, throw a fit about it. I'm trying to analyze the policy and whether they make the world and America better. If he succeeds, and I hope he succeeds despite everything, I mean, if he succeeds and he lines his pocket, fine. But I'm sure he won't be squeamish.
Hal, the irony is we're getting a question on TikTok about this live stream. And TikTok is a bit of an exhibit around how Trump's own financial incentives can be unpredictable around policy. He had been in favor of banning TikTok during his first tour through the White House, arguing that it was a Trojan horse, essentially, for Chinese interests, that Americans had put this app on their phones and everyone was using it. It would be a convenient backdoor to hack into American computer networks should the Chinese want to, because of the state's own ownership interest in TikTok. One of his big campaign donors was a TikTok investor. Trump has since softened his tune on TikTok. And here we are. It's unclear whether, there is a ban on TikTok moving very quickly now. It's moved through Congress. They're now appealing it to the Supreme Court, but we'll see where it goes. But Trump could come into office with this as an unresolved issue. And without focusing or pinning you down on TikTok specifically, again, it feels to me like one of among the many unusual things about a Trump presidency is it is difficult, if not impossible, to unravel his own financial incentives or financial interests from policymaking in a way I can't at least in the modern era, I can't think of another president encumbered with those sort of financial conflicts of interest who's also acting out on them.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, we haven't had a president like Trump in a long time, if ever, one who had, so many business entanglements, and many of them are rather murky. It's interesting that you mentioned China in particular, because I actually think this is a good example of an area where the range of outcomes is actually quite broad. And so I think that ideally Trump would like sort of a grand, terrific bargain with China of the sort that he pursued during his first term. The idea was to get this trade deal that would change the terms of the U.S.-China economic relationship. And it didn't quite turn out that way because of COVID and because of some other things. And so this time around, I mean, I think Trump's sort of transactional instincts are the same, and he would be happy to consider an agreement that would actually deepen the U.S.-China economic relationship if he thought that was going to improve the trade balance, for instance. I think it's going to be hard for him to get there because so many of the structural factors in the relationship are pushing toward competition and confrontation. And because a lot of the tools he's going to use to try to develop leverage on China will be sort of confrontational in a directional sense. But again, I think there's actually a divide here between what Trump wants in theory and what the real China hawks want in terms of sort of national security posturing and economic and technological decoupling. And TikTok might be a good example of that.
Hal, one of the seminal events has been Hamas's launching of a brutal, murderous offensive against Israel, and Israel's overweening response to that, and then the echoes of that across the Middle East, which we've seen most recently, I think, in Syria with the rapid demise of the Assad regime. But not just that, but what's actually happened since his downfall. Israel's used that as an opportunity to target military sites across Syria and really reduce its, I don't know if it's safe to say reduce its military capabilities to nothing, but it certainly seems as such. How do you think of this reordered Middle East that Trump is going to be inheriting from Biden, and how should people think about what's the path forward there?
Trump gave an interview the other day where he said the bad news is that Ukraine is hard. The good news is that the Middle East is easy, and at least half of that statement is true. But there is, there has.
We'll have to define easy.
Yeah, there has been a real seismic change in the Middle East, and I think the short version of this is that Trump comes in with a tremendous amount of leverage vis-a-vis Iran, because Iran has had its proxies dramatically weaken pretty much everywhere except for Yemen over the past few months. It has been set back militarily by Israel. It's had its air defenses, its strategic air defenses at least, shredded by Israeli attacks. And so if your priority is to get Iran to rein in its nuclear program, which is what Trump has talked about, you're in a strong position because Iran is geopolitically and militarily weak at the moment. And Trump is going to try to exacerbate that by layering lots of sanctions on and trying to take Iranian oil off the market in the way that he did during the first term. So he's set up for success in one respect. The challenge is that it's still not going to be easy, right? And one, Trump is going to have to figure out what he wants. Does he just want a nuclear deal with Iran, or does he want to try to exert enough pressure so that the regime implodes? He's going to have to figure out how to bring along the Gulf states, which are wary of going along with a maximum pressure campaign because they're worried that they're going to get left holding the bag, as happened in 2019. He's going to have to figure out how to deal with the oil market implications. And he's going to have to figure out what is the or else, right? If Iran doesn't decide to cut a nuclear deal, is Trump going to be okay with Israel using force against the program, or the United States doing it itself? And so it's one of these things where the situation is more favorable to what Trump wants to do than one might have expected a year ago, but there are still numerous complexities he's going to have to resolve.
Andreas, let's look at Ukraine. Trump this week said that Zelensky should move quickly towards concluding the war. I don't know how fully that is Zelensky's choice. The Ukrainians themselves have dug in. They're resource constrained. The war's been going on a long time. Winter is coming. And Putin has been willing to open the floodgates of prisons to man the battlefield. But it's come at a great cost to Russia too. The economy is not strong, and it's been taxed profoundly by the war that Putin launched. Where does Trump go looking at this if he's coming into it telling Ukraine that it's time to back down?
And by the way, just to add to your list of terrible news, the North Koreans are now fighting, and apparently I saw dying as well. So therefore, the specter that we've been talking about for a long time of both an axis of North Korea, Russia, China, Iran, and of a wide spreading of these conflicts becoming connected is growing, the specter. And where does he come in? This is, in my opinion, the most important, most decisive conflict right now, because so much is at stake, including the entire United Nations Charter. And this is also the conflict where Trump, if you know his past, I won't relitigate the first impeachment and all of it, where there are most suspicions, and where Zelensky has the most legitimate reason to be very afraid. Trump, raised expectations so impossibly high, saying he'll get this settled in either one day or before he even takes office, that everyone is afraid he's going to sell Ukraine out. So, and that must not happen unless we have a cascade of consequences that would lead to, I think, the abolition of the world order, international law, everything, and a return to sphere of influences where they carve up the world together. The question he has goes a little bit to madman theory and all the things Hal and I have been saying is, what is Trump's leverage? What does he think it is? Or is there something we don't know? Because he and Putin apparently do talk, and they or at least pretend to like each other. I think Trump probably genuinely admires Putin more than he respects even Zelensky. So I'm very worried. But because we have so much uncertainty, and there are other European NATO partners, for instance, France is getting more and more, should we say, hawkish or discovering a spine, And in Germany, it's unresolved right now because they just toppled the government.
And a reminder that France's
alone.
Government just fell as well. So
I'm sorry.
And France's government just fell, as well.
Yes, but it's not the president in that case, just his cabinet. So it's still Macron. So it won't be Trump alone, which is good. But he has to make the Ukrainians as strong as he can now. And of course, Putin is trying to do the opposite, so that when they talk, there will definitely be talks of some form. The Ukrainians talk from a position of strength, and then you get into the option. What is it? Is it like in East-West Germany model? What kind of security guarantees? And then Trump will have to show his hand. And I just hope that he isn't that it would be the opposite of the madman theory, that he doesn't signal too early that he just wants a peace deal, that the only thing he has is to sell out the Ukrainians. And I'm afraid that might happen in some form.
Hal, I want to sort of set a fantasy scenario for you where you're in the Oval Office yourself, and you can ask the incoming president to do one thing in an ideal world, or two. Doesn't have to limit to one, but if you could take out your magic wand and convince Trump to do one or two things at the start of his term that would give you confidence about the United States' place in the world and an engagement with foreign affairs and realities overseas that would be good for everyone involved, every stakeholder in that ecosystem, what might that be?
I'd ask for a big plus up in U.S. military spending combined with an effort to get serious about entitlement reform. He might do the former. He's definitely not going to do the latter. But since this is a make believe scenario, I can still ask for it. I mean, the reality is that a bunch of the problems the U.S. has right now is that we are just spread way too thin militarily across 3 regions of trouble. This is the reason why the U.S. can't get the Houthis to knock it off in the Red Sea. It's the reason why the trade-offs between Ukraine and Taiwan seem so severe. And as sort of erratic and unilateral as Trump is, I actually think it would be good for the overall health of the international system if the U.S. had a level of military resources that was more commensurate with its commitments around the world.
Andreas, briefly, what would you do if you had a magic wand?
First of all, I think Hal is right. The United States right now has a grand strategy of having a military that's able to win 1.5, like one major, one minor war at the same time. And we might, hopefully not, be in a position where the U.S. has to fight 4 wars at once. That can't happen. So therefore, we either must withdraw from some or increase military spending. And since, as Hal said, we won't be able to accomplish entitlement reform, that would only be possible with a fiscal crisis. So we have a problem. If I had only one magic wand, or if I were Michael Waltz, this won't happen. But I would say, Trump, drop the madman shtick and spell out clearly some objectives that make you more predictable and signal that you're willing to escalate just in those few things. Draw red lines, if you will, leave them just vague enough so that they don't become liabilities. But drop the madman shtick and be reasonable, and then friends and foes know what they're dealing with, and maybe we can work something out, maybe like even nuclear disarmament or something.
Yeah, the problem there is you can't drop a shtick if it's not a shtick. But
as I said, but you said a magic wand. It's a magic wand.
Yes. Hal Brands, Andreas Kluth, thank you for joining us today. This has been Bloomberg Opinions Politics live stream, and we will see you again soon. Thank you all for joining us.